Onegaishimasu. And let's start with a few moments of Zazen. Letting the mind sink into the body. Allowing the body to open and release and weight settle. An imagery that comes to mind, we've been talking about weight underside. And so the weight congregates, collects at the bottom points, bottom edges. And that's kind of half the formula, half the equation. The other half of the equation is the result eventually is that everything above that line becomes open and clarified. So we talked about weight underside along the bottom edge, and everything else is then released and open. When we're standing, we'll talk about releasing the weight down, releasing the tensions down, rooting. As we do weight underside, settling, it actually opens and empties and frees the upper body. So an imagery that comes to mind for me with that is like an aquarium with the silt settling. So all the particles in the water settle, and then the water itself becomes clearer and clearer. The more that it settles, and so those particles are our tensions and tightnesses. And that silt, that gray matter, that hard, heavy matter is all up in the air, dispersed, that's through the body. As we let that settle, just like the aquarium becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, the more that settles. The more that we can settle our body, release our tensions down, the more open and clear our body becomes, more clarified our posture becomes. And it's exactly the same for the mind. The more we can settle our thoughts, let the silt of the mind settle, instead of everything being up in the air, up in the water, and the water becomes very, very cloudy, you can't see through it. That's like our mind a lot of the time, full of so many things, thoughts, worries, concerns, in the future and in the past. That's like the water being filled with all these particulates, very cloudy, not a very clear, sharp mind, certainly not a free mind. As we let the particles settle, the silt settle, let those thoughts settle and calm, the mind becomes clearer and clearer. So that's something you can keep in mind if it helps for your body and your mind as we do Zazen, and actually as we go into movement as well. So as we settle physical stuff, tensions, tightness, and as we settle mental stuff, thoughts, concerns, the body becomes open and clarified, the body becomes open and crystal clear. You could even imagine your thoughts actually settling, just like the particles in the water. Now, keeping all that settled material, keeping the silt down at the bottom, not stirring it up. Or notice when you start to stir it up with your movement, pulling up, or your tight thoughts. Notice when you start to stir it up, allow it to settle again. So with that thought or imagery of everything settled, the lowest points, including our thoughts, we come up and see if we can keep all that just settled. Keep it settled. Notice when you pull up and notice when you stir up the sediment, you stir it up, it's gotten cloudy again. See if you can allow it to settle. And bring that into your standing. Notice how much is up. There's going to be, no doubt, certain parts that are up, certain tensions. And that's particles, particulates that are still up in the water. Kind of let all the particulates settle. And just like when the particles in the water settle, the water doesn't disappear, the water doesn't settle, the water becomes clarified. As we settle our weight and our tensions, the body doesn't sink down, the body becomes open and clarified as this internal stuff settles. Particulates settle, water becomes open and clear. See if we can bring that into our standing. Just notice how much particulates are held up. Let it settle. Again, the water doesn't sink down, the water stays open, just becomes more and more clear. And the tanden, or the hara, often called in the Aikido circles the 1 point. 1 point is about 3 inches below the navel. That's a good tool to have the mind and the breath settle. So that's like where you can imagine everything settles to, and then from here down to the feet. But the actual center, physical center of the body is here, and it becomes a good mental tool, a place to settle to. Now, at first, it's hard for people to focus their mind to a point. That takes more practice and more time. In Tai Chi, we'll often talk about the bowl of the hips. Think of the skeletal, the bone structure of the hips. It forms like a basin, like a bowl. So that's kind of a nice imagery, something nice to relate to. It's a place where the mind and the breath can settle into. Imagine that's literal. Imagine the mind and breath can settle into this basin. That's the equivalent of weight underside, mental and physical. That's the equivalent of that particulate settling in the water. So this becomes the basin where the silt settles, the mind's tensions, the body's tensions. And each time we exhale, it's kind of like a extra amount of letting go that we can allow, allowing things to settle. To the 1 point, it's about 3 inches below the navel, just inside the body, or if it's more relatable for your mind, the bowl of the hips, a reservoir into which the mind and breath settles. And the more it settles, the more the upper body is opened, clarified, and released. And the more weight can sink through the feet. So feel the resultant release, openness, your spine gets longer, body gets taller and more open, but without muscularly trying to do that, you're just released and open. Another imagery very much in line with this, but a very different imagery, is you imagine a balloon that wants to float up, but has a string tied bottom of the balloon, and that string is tied to a platform or a brick. So it's well anchored. And so that brick is, you can think of it as the 1 point or the tailbone, basically the hip girdle. The string is the spine. And then of course, the balloon is the head. So the string is gently taut. It's not rigid, but it's gently taut because of the rising balloon. So we don't want our spine to be rigid. It's long and open, so it can be even more free and flexible and flowing. And so if anything disturbs the balloon or even the string, it moves very, very easy, very fluidly, just like seaweed in the ocean. It's also always long, flowing up, and it's flexible and free to move with any disturbance. Again, just like that string with the balloon. So your spine and your body It's not rigid. So we have to be very careful when we talk about extension or posture. In this case, simply this uprightness, tall and upright, that there's no tension involved with that. So just like the seaweed or just like this string, gently pulled, tautly pulled up in a very gentle way. We're open, spacious, long, extended, but no tension. So if you want to imagine the balloon, the string, and that weighted platform here, or tailbone. So whatever you can relate to, whatever triggers some good things for you, whether it's the imagery of the weighted string and the balloon, keeping everything nice and long and open, or the settling of silt, clarifying the mind and body, or simply resting below the navel or in the bowl of the hips. And the more you do that, the more upper body is opened and emptied and long. Whichever you can connect to best right now that gives you quality, a feeling, we'll take that into movement, into some very soft Manucci. Some very soft Manucci, because we want to take this not just in Zazen, not just in stationary standing, but the whole idea, that's just all training, precursors to bring this into movement. So we're changing the quality of our mind and our body. And then the idea, of course, is then to perpetuate that refined quality, that evolved quality into everything we do, even our techniques, even when we're throwing our partner, even when we're doing something that seems like, very specific to a joint. It's actually, these qualities liberate us so we don't get defeated by our own efforting. Even if we defeat our opponent, we're actually working against ourselves. We're not doing ourselves any help, any good. It's just like when you think of violent thoughts, and you might even beat the other person, but you had all this poison that you've created inside your body. You didn't do yourself any favors, any help. Even doing a so-called joint technique, it's really not a joint technique, it's much more whole than that. We want all these same qualities. Otherwise, we're doing stuff to ourselves that just makes our tightness worse, aggravates the tightnesses we already tend to have, physically and mentally. We often talk about hanging the hips, pressing the foot into the ground. Those are just ways to not do it with your upper body and not do it with over muscularization. So in this case right now, another angle of getting to this development is you can imagine the balloon is floating. It's light, open and floating, but it's also anchored. Or you can imagine the settling of silt. The water clarifies and clears, or simply weight underside, or resting, settled below the navel. And let's take this into another move and see how much you can release. And when we say release, it's mainly down. We mentioned the other day that down is primary, if I can release down. So when we say down is primary, that relates to the silt. The only way the water is going to clarify and be really released is the more down is allowed to happen. The more the silt, the particulates can sift and settle down, only then is there a clarification and a clearing. So releasing, relaxing, and rather than being pulled down, that actually clarifies and opens everything else. Maybe you can notice your shoulder joints sometimes specifically. Can I let that be more spacious and open? Elbow joints. Am I leaning a little bit? That means I'm not letting the settling occur vertically, naturally with gravity. I'm doing other stuff. Just let everything just settle vertically. So this is overdoing, over striving. The work is just learning to release and align. Awareness, Am I aligned? Am I misaligned? Am I striving? Am I contracting? Or am I being aligned, open, released, and flowing? And then see if you can take that into just one beat and be as open, clarified, and released and soft as you can be each time, and then throughout, even through the transition. Notice in the transition, if there's an upness or coming inness, chances are there's a little bit of that in there somewhere, maybe in the transition. Weight underside, that allows an opening and clarification, cleansing and a clearing. Now let's just touch upon just a little bit, get a little bit more martial for a moment. This is all very martial, but to get a little bit more specific with this, I'll mention this because it takes us into the direction of the martial application without us having to get oof, and again, get violent in our mind and body. It's the same sort of opening, pleasant, harmonious expression. And also because with Senpai, I was talking with Senpai just the last class about Sayuendo. Remember this, Senpai? If you have trouble doing Sayuendo to someone, if they're grabbing your hand or your arm and they're strong or heavy, just let the elbow point go. So just now emphasize the elbow point a bit more. It's an elbow strike and then an opening, but without any ensuing tension, tightness. Of course, when we start to think about elbow strike, things are going to start to probably contract and shirk in and tighten in. In one sense, we get a sense of more power if I tighten up, just like more power when I throw a punch if I'm tight. That's a certain degree of truth, but it's not the whole truth. It's not a complete truth. It's a practical and efficient truth because it's a quick get, but it's not the best whole truth. So notice when you start to think about using your elbow point, things tightening up, shoulder, back of the shoulder, even the stomach, if your mind, and try to keep it as soft and open and flowing like that seaweed at the bottom of the ocean, but you just have an intentional vector. You have an intentional point. So that arm's going to bend a bit more and just send all that energy and all that accumulated energy through one point instead of through the whole lateral edge, through one point. Then it just becomes more piercing, more percussive, more piercing, not because you're trying to be more violent or harsher. You're just choosing awareness and intention. You're choosing to use the expression in a slightly different shape, slightly different energetic transmission. And this becomes, again, a very effective martial application without any of that tightness or harshness or violent qualities and approach. So in fact, to take this a little bit further, everything's generated and flowing through that one little point, and then let the arm open and follow like a flower. That's in fact how we do this technique, literally with a partner, literally with an opponent, is it can be bang and that open. So the actual throw, Sayuendo, is actually the opening of that arm. So let all this accumulated, generated, directed force from the ground through your relaxed, open body through this one point and let it naturally unfurl. Very as relaxed and natural as a flower opening. Furukoki Endo. See how open and released you can be. Imagine that solid platform or a brick, the string, which is your spine, the floating balloon that keeps you open and spacious as you do Furukoki Endo. So your lower body is the brick or that heavy platform. From here down, the platform. You can even imagine this being below the ground. The spine is that string. The head is that open balloon. Grounded, secure, connected to the earth, open, spacious, free, connected to the sky. You have both, yin and yang. And see if you can keep those qualities as you go into the turn. So this is always continuing to settle and sink. And as a result of that, this continues to open and be light and spacious. Let's take that into some Tenkan Undo, so some just basic movements to take these qualities, principles into action. So keeping it relatively simple, so the 90-degree Tenkan. If you want to add a slide step, feel free, but notice when you start to deviate away from the principles or simply start to tighten up. So what's more important is staying with those principles and qualities and noticing when and where you lose those qualities. The shoulders, shoulder joints, stomach, upper body as a whole, neck. Again, that's part of being aware in our body, staying present in our body. The mind is in our body. Very, very clear, sharp movement would be very soft and released. Work your verticality. Are you deviating from that verticality at all? And why? Is it because you're striving to go forward? Are you coming from up here rather than coming from your base or your center? I'm coming from up here, they'll tend to lurch me forward. Try a few 180 degrees, even more movement. Notice when and where you lose it. And just slow down. The main strategy when you notice you're losing things is to slow down. Make the movement slower, maybe make the movement smaller. Okay. Now, we've been working a little bit with the strike. So before we move into the actual application of the technique in the 7th Q adult program, let's just take another look at people's Shomanuchi. So take this into the Shomanuchi. So you're noticing things like, am I tightening up? Am I leaning? My upper body? Stay nice and vertical. You only get more expansive. The other class, we're talking more about the biomechanics, emphasizing the mechanics, pressing down to turn the hip. Turning the hip raises the elbow, and turning the hip makes the step. Otherwise, the step is light and empty. If we just do everything right, but then we step, that's light and empty, which means martially it's vulnerable. Martially, it's not effective. Okay, martially, it's not sound. So turning the hip, that makes a step. But we're not going to emphasize that right so much today. We're trying to stay with these qualities and feelings. But if you keep these qualities and feelings, it'll tend to create those mechanics. Let me show you why, what I mean by that. So again, the other day, we're talking a lot about the mechanic of pushing the hip, pushing the foot down to turn the hip, and that makes the step and drives the elbow up. Well, if I'm truly hanging out, if I'm truly grounded, if I'm that string that's anchored, I'm coming from the ground, I'm pressing from the ground. I'm pressing from the ground, that's going to turn my hip, and the ground's going to propel me while I stay nice and open. If I'm grounded and open, I'm not going to separate from the ground for my step. I'm not going to separate from the ground with my raising of the arm. I'm not going to separate my upper body from my lower body by raising my arm because I'm settled. So all those biomechanics we talked about the other day will tend to naturally occur by integrating these principles. Settle the silt, the mental and physical particulates, feel the clarification, opening, and see if you can keep that in your movement. Another example of an important martial aspect that happens naturally if we're doing these proper body conditionings, developing an Aikido body, back crown of the head goes up, or in other words, again, this is light and suspended from above. That drops us down slightly. Martially, that's very important in protecting the throat. As opposed to many people, if not most people, they tend to have this up here, or at least at some point. And their body will go forward, but they're still thinking up here and still looking from up here. So this is up, or they might even start that way. So another example of these conditionings, developing, cultivating the body, will tend to create all the martial technicalities and tactics that we're always talking about, but they happen organically, spontaneously, and for you. They happen spontaneously for you, more and more of these details, without mechanically having to think about it and do it. You just find yourself, oh my goodness, all these things that we talked about, all these mechanics, they actually start to happen when I work on these mind and body cultivation aspects. Try a few yokomen. So biomechanically, we talked about shomen turns to yokomen only because my lower body, and therefore my spine and upper body, my lower body simply turns so very slightly. I turn my hip just slightly. So there's shomen, straight foot, and that's yokomen. Of course, that's not just my foot, obviously. That's from the hip. So shomen, straight foot, straight leg, yokomen. So that's the harmony of the body. It's maintained. I'm not stepping and then doing something with my arm. It's my holistic approach, my whole body. Really focus on the mechanics and the organics of raising, and that'll make a really good cut, really good strike. If you think of striking, all this will be like that empty step, artificial separated step. If I think of the strike, all this will be artificial and separate and empty. And I'm trying really hard for the strike, a lot of striving, a lot of tension. Striving and tension separates you from organic wholeness and environmental wholeness. So really focus on the rising, and then you'll have a really good strike. The strike will happen almost for you and through you. So how true, aligned and open, connected from the ground up can you be for the raising of the strike? And just stay with those qualities and feelings. From there, the strike will happen for you. Release the abdomen. That always helps. Point the tailbone to the ground. Hang the hips. That makes that string long and open. If I use the imagery of that weighted platform and the string, People who are standing up, normal way of standing. A lot of the tension is here. It's a big curve here, very big, very tight here, and here. Again, the chin up a little bit. So that'd be like a string. Instead of being nicely, gently, tautly pulled, nice and straight and vertical, that'd be like the string being kinked here, and kinked up here. So the string or this light chain is kinked here and kinked up here at the neck, and probably other places too. So I want that string to be virtually long and straight. I don't want that string to be kinked. So tune in, visualize your string, be self-honest. Is that string kinked here? Is it kinked here? And see if you can be more gently, lightly opened, lengthened. Okay, let's take that into what we're doing just the other day, 7th Q program, Sugiyashi Shomanuchi. So as I push off the back foot, that's raising of the sword. As I settle that back foot back, that's the cutting of the sword. So I'll be shoman. So the difference is that we're using the front arm. Often where it's the back arm stepping through with the back leg. So this is the front arm. Remember, keep the other arm active and alive, both sides equally alive. So Sugiyashi, shoman. Sugiyashi, shoman. Open up, joints open, hang out. Pushing off that back leg, sends everything out. Settling that back leg back. Draws the arm down, but your weight stays in the forward leg, left leg. Let's do a few on the other side. Forward stance, pushing off, sliding over, shoman, straight down. Offline, expand, settle. Check your verticality. Okay, I'm going to come towards you slowly at first, and you'll just turn it. You'll come offline, allow the attack to come in, and you intercept it with your movement. This is protective, by the way. Raising the sword, that's also a protective movement. If you imagine you're coming in with a push or a strike, this is covering my center line. That's a protective movement as well. So I don't know exactly where they're going to attack. Are they going to be grabbing me? Or are they going to be punching me? I don't know exactly. So this becomes covering the bases. Not in defensively, it's potentially expressive as well. But raising is covering, and here is issuing. Covering, issuing. Okay, here I come. Go faster. Okay, let's do the other side. So back to this side, and I'll come towards you. Have a sense of intercepting the attack. You're intercepting the interaction. I don't know if this will make sense to you, but it's like sewing, or you're integrating. So it's not like you're going, whoa, bop. It's like you are penetrating, intercepting, interrupting, not bopping. You're slicing, it's surgery. You're surgical. not blunt force trauma. You're surgically interrupting. So the sharper and clearer you get, the more laser light you get with your energy in your mind, the more that will make sense. I'm intercepting and interweaving. Different feel, right? That's all mind and awareness. That's all level of mind. And spirit. Okay, then the other footwork is Ayumiyashi. So now Shomen will be coming from the back arm. The back arm, back leg become the front arm. So it looks like this. Ayumiyashi. So as always, pushing out that back foot drives the arm up, pedaling the back foot back is the cut. Nice and open. Mind is free, and therefore the body is relaxed and flowing. Let's do a few on the other side. Start correct, start good, take a moment, an extra moment or two to get the feeling and the shape and the quality. It's much more powerful and potent if you take that extra time before you start moving. It's much less effective to try to get everything as you're moving. It's never as good. Take the extra moment, extra patience to set things up as best you can. Then you take so much more into it. It's like stationary in movement. All the things we get in our stationary practice, sitting, standing, we just bring it into our movement. Okay, I'm going to come towards the camera. You want to time that. And just intercept it. Intercept it.